Hello, everyone, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you in person, but hopefully this video will be able to get across the majority of my argument, and between Skype and some wonderful colleagues who have offered to help out in my stead, hopefully this will make some sort of a compromise here. So my paper aims to do two different things, and I would like to lay them both out in advance, along with a request of all of you. The first is I'd like to help us face the often uncomfortable extent to which our field is implicated in imperialism, colonialism, and racism. And I would like us to have a real reckoning with whether we can meaningfully separate ourselves from that history. This is a conversation many of us are starting to have in different corners of the field, but it's something that we really need to grapple with. When students at Reed object that their humanities survey course, Hume 110, and I'm quoting here, perpetuates white supremacy by centering whiteness as the only required class at Reed, end quote, we need to take that argument seriously, much as our first instinct may well be a defensive defense of the text that we love. We need to think about ways that we might be perpetuating the kinds of colonial mindsets that we rail against in other contexts. This will involve an unfortunately brief romp through a lot of theory. And due to exciting weather adventures, I was not able to provide a paper copy of my bibliography for you all, but I would be more than happy to send you a file of the bibliography that I discuss here. So the second major thing that I would like to accomplish with this paper is to open up a place for all of us to be critical of certain types of work without that resulting in a personal attack of the people doing that work. As I get into this discussion, I would ask us all to be generous listeners and thinkers. Many of us think of ourselves as social justice-minded liberals and, by extension, quote-unquote, good people. Some of the things I will be discussing and critiquing here are things that many of us in this room have done. Before I jump in, I would like to acknowledge that I, too, have made many of these mistakes, but I am trying to be better. And I hope that you all will feel the same way. As I'm sure many of us have heard, probably quoted, possibly misquoted, out of context online somewhere, Maya Angelou once said, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." The other quote I'd like to start with is from the recent rebranding of Eidolon as Classics Without Fragility. I want to ask us all to approach the discussions we have about outreach without fragility or defensiveness. So, disclaimers aside, let's get going. I don't intend to spend much time on the basic premise that classics and a classical education are deeply connected to the British Empire. A great deal of scholarship has been written on this. There would have been a slide here with a selection of recent scholarship, but please contact me if you would like this or any other bibliography referenced in this talk. And I am happy to explore this more in the Q&A time, but I think that most of us would accept that the history of our field is tied up with British and other imperial projects. Instead, raise two specific, interconnected facets of this topic that are less universally acknowledged, though I'll be leaving a lot of this for the discussion that will hopefully take place after this panel, online and elsewhere. The first of these topics is the extent to which classics, and what we think of as the classical canon, has or has not been decolonized. The second is how imperialism as an ideology has permeated pedagogy in the United States more broadly. Here, I'm adopting a critical pedagogy framework that builds on the work of many thinkers, most notably Paulo Freire and his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and his work is in turn influenced by Frantz Fanon, whose work was heavily influenced by Marxism, to trace just one ideological lineage. I apologize if everyone here already knows this, but I do want to make sure that we're starting from a common point here, because I, and I suspect many others, have gone to a lot of pedagogy workshops to improve my teaching, but they focused on practical approaches to teaching rather than on more abstract theoretical topics. So critical pedagogy is, in Freire's initial formulation, concerned with conscientização, a Portuguese word that's generally translated as critical consciousness. And he calls for liberation as a transformational practice that necessitates rethinking the basic hierarchy between students and teachers. He calls for a very radical pedagogy. For those of you unfamiliar with Freire's own history, he paid a high price for his revolutionary pedagogy, precisely because it was seen as dangerous. His ideas and the ideas of those following in his tradition have helped fuel revolutionary movements in apartheid South Africa and in segregated America. I'd like to pause here and mention why this is a particular theoretical thread that I'm focusing on. The kind of work that so many of us do in this room, and many more of us who are unable to make it here for a variety of reasons, the sort of work that we want to do, is in some sense or another aimed at making a more just and equitable world. And I want to challenge us to really think about what that means. In the words of Joseph Gordon-Levitt in Inception, and I am truly sad that I can't have a clip of this in this video version, we mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger. Either we need to accept the basic outlines of what it means to teach in the university, or we need to think about what a massive systemic change might look like. I don't mean to criticize anyone who is doing this work, but I don't think we should be content with reading Homer at a homeless shelter if we aren't doing it with some larger understanding of why we are doing this. Digression over for a moment, but I will return to this point because I think there's more to unpack there. But first, I want to double back and finish laying out an outline of critical pedagogy. And I offer here a passage from Freire that highlights the structural change that he calls for. Quote, "Authentic thinking, thinking that is concerned about reality, does not take place in ivory tower isolation, but only in communication. If it is true that thought has meaning only when generated by action upon the world, the subordination of students to teachers becomes impossible." End quote. Really think about what that means, because this kind of teaching necessarily embraces student resistance. And I want to call our thoughts back to those protests at Reed and elsewhere. If we want to engage in actual revolutionary pedagogy, we need to be ready to hear these criticisms and ready to rethink quote-unquote classical exceptionalism. We need to accept that the traditional place of classics within the academy is problematic for a number of reasons. And on this point, I would direct you to Rebecca Kennedy's recent work on race and ethnicity in the ancient and modern world as a wonderful starting place. None of this means that we can't still love and teach classics, but it does mean that we need to really reckon with the problems of our field. We need to understand that Greek and Latin have been used by gatekeepers as a mark of intelligence and a mark of civilization. We need to face how and why classics has been used as a tool to oppress Indigenous people across the world. In the interest of time, I will leave that point there, but I do want to mention a book that has helped me think about some of my own preconceptions about outreach, and that prompted me to submit this abstract in the first place. This book is Christopher Emdin's For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too, Reality Pedagogy and Urban Education. I really recommend everyone read this book, but for my purposes here, I want to talk in particular about the idea of neo-indigeneity that he returns to throughout the book. Though this book is primarily about primary and secondary education, I think it has a great deal to offer university instructors in general, but particularly university instructors who work or intend to work within communities of color. This book begins by defining white folks, and Emden makes clear that white folks refers to more than the race of the instructor. In fact, he writes, quote, "There are Black and white educators who can be seen as white folks because the needs of Black and brown students become secondary to sustaining the status quo. They maintain a system that doesn't serve the needs of students in the hood," end quote. White folks' pedagogy, then, is something distinct from the actual race of the teacher, and he goes on to describe it as a deeply Eurocentric pedagogy that can hurt students of color. This is where the concept of neo-Indigenous is particularly helpful. Emden compares urban youth to the Indigenous Americans who were educated at the Carlisle School. The Carlisle School was a product of a very well-intentioned group of white people who thought they were helping Indigenous children while actually doing what we now recognize as deep and lasting damage to the very people they were trying to help. Those educators forcibly assimilated Indigenous youth to the white dominant educational paradigm on a generous reading on the assumption that this would help Indigenous youth succeed. We can now see that this was a colonialist project, and education was part of a broader pattern of colonizing Indigenous lands, bodies, and minds. Urban education is similar, Emden writes. and he introduces the concept of neo-indigeneity to describe urban youth who are being similarly harmed by quote-unquote white folks. And this quote is taken from the same book as well. Recognizing the neo-indigeneity of youth requires acknowledgement of the soul wounds that teaching practices inflict upon them, end quote. Put another way, there is something entirely colonial about how American education approaches teaching in quote-unquote the hood, as he describes it. We, and I use we here because I don't want to suggest that I am not complicit in this. I have constantly had to check myself as I have started working on community-based learning and outreach. We often think and talk about bringing classics to these different communities in a way that heavily echoes the sort of hierarchy that critical pedagogy critiques. In my abstract, I noted that there's already something problematic about the language of outreach if we want to press on that language and think about what it suggests in terms of an in and an out group. I suggested that we need to think about how we position ourselves in relation to the others to whom we reach out. For example, veterans, the homeless, or prison inmates. Such work, I noted, is often described in terms of bringing classics to those who are less fortunate, which implicitly frames academia as a sort of Prometheus who brings the gift of learning to those who stand in grave need of our beneficence. And that's where I would really like to focus for the remainder of this paper. To return to something I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's enough to say that the world needs classics, and we are doing something intrinsically good by bringing classics to people who wouldn't otherwise have classics. On a practical level, I would note that we already have a bit of an image problem, and that classics is fundamentally connected to privilege. It's taught at elite institutions with staggering tuition fees. It often requires extensive language instruction, which makes classics inaccessible to millions of people across the country, particularly those who attend underfunded public schools without a Latin program. On top of that, we have proven distressingly appealing to white supremacists as of late. Combined with the imperialist elements I've touched on briefly already, I would urge us all to be extra careful about the work that we do. Good intentions simply are not enough. And were I there with a PowerPoint to show you, I would provide just a smattering of headlines that about 5 minutes of Googling turned up. And here I would be generalizing a bit, I recognize, but there's a real focus on these headlines about the harm that well-intentioned white people do, particularly to protest and activist movements that have gone on in the recent years in our country. Now, as one final bit of framing, I want to tell a brief story about, this is the story that a low-income student of color told at a forum at Notre Dame about what it's like to be a marginalized student at an elite, and here elite was standing in for a very expensive institution. This was a really fantastic forum where students from several Ivy Leagues, Stanford, and Notre Dame talked about their experiences being marginalized, either by their first-generation college status, their race, ethnicity, their family background, their income level, all sorts of different factors that made them marginalized on these campuses. This was a student from Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's Catholic mission drives a lot of the charity and outreach that happens on campus, and there is truly a lot of it. But she drew a distinction between compassion and charity. Charity, to my mind, is a lot like pity. And when I'm not talking about outreach, I work on tragedy, and I'm fresh off some pity-based discussions at the end of last semester, so bear with me here. Charity often, and perhaps always, comes from a place of different power and privilege. Charity is something you offer downward to the less fortunate. When we approach outreach that way, we risk being condescending, and we ruin opportunities to do actual, meaningful good. We also burn bridges for people who might come after us. If we insult or demean a community, what earthly reason do they have to work with us or someone like us in the future? Further, as with charity work in general, we can sometimes focus on the good that it does the people who are serving. It's good for our students to get outside of their bubbles. It's good for them to see people who aren't like them. It's good for them to gain perspective. And it is. Many of our students will go on to hold powerful positions. It's important for them to learn compassion and to learn about people who come from different backgrounds than their own. But when we use outreach as a way to teach them compassion, we exploit these various communities to teach our students something important about the world. So I would ask us all to resist the urge to think that any outreach is good outreach. Good intentions need to be matched with good practices and good execution. I call on classicists not to accept a low bar here. Being better than X other field or X institution isn't enough. And by being more mindful about the work that we do, we can make sure that we do not do any harm and are in fact maximizing the good that we do. To end, I would like to leave you all with a few best practices. Again, bomb cyclone, so I don't have a copy of these available for you, but I would love to send anyone an electronic copy, and hopefully we'll be able to have some of this list projected up on whatever sort of AV that we have available here. But I will at least narrate some of these points. And I do know that Alina attended one of the same trainings that I have, so she can perhaps speak to some of these best practices in my absence. So the biggest thing that I've learned in the work that I've done in preparing for community-based courses, and I should mention here that I participated in the University of Michigan's Engaged Pedagogy Initiative, which is a wonderful program that's doing really great work. I'll be teaching a course next summer working with the Notre Dame Shakespeare Festival to bring college students together with local community members to produce an adaptation of a Greek tragedy tailored and adapted to address issues that are of interest to the community members involved in the performance. And the biggest thing that I've learned is that you need to make the investment of time and preparation in advance. The students need to be well trained on a variety of fronts, not least of which is how to question their own preconceptions about the other communities that they're going to come in contact with. I have assembled here a list of common, well-intentioned mistakes that people make with community-based learning, and they fit into several big categories. Many of them involve thinking that simply coming up with a good idea and having a good intentions and a good idea is going to make a project work well. And you can see here, volunteers need training, and providing volunteers and then removing those volunteers can in fact do far more harm than good, as it will in fact sort of destabilize programs that have volunteers and the students who are being involved there. This can really do a lot of harm to community networks. And then another major category I want to draw attention to here is a tendency that I think we all have to privilege academic knowledge at the exclusion of other types of knowledge. And this is very much a place where we can tend to fall back on our expertise, this idea that we understand a text better than someone else because we know the Greek or we know the Latin, and maybe not be thinking about other ways that lived experience or a different perspective can in fact be just as valuable and useful perspective on the text. But our students are experts at some things, we are experts at some things as well, but when we come into something with the idea that we are just here to dispense knowledge and dispense information, that is not, I don't think, a particularly constructive way to approach these sort of projects. So I have high hopes that I will be able to participate in question and answers after this, but I would really love to hear through email or through whatever forum we follow up on this panel with, would love to hear people's thoughts about some of these lingering issues about the canon and the way that classics is sort of implicated in a lot of these systems, and then what exactly it would mean to do really meaningful, transformative work with our outreach programs. And unfortunately, I'm not able to hear about the rest of the projects that were being discussed in this panel, but I'm very excited about the sort of work that these other panelists have done, and I look forward to continuing these discussions and really heading in a more, continuing to have discussions about ways that we can make the work we do better, stronger, and more enduring and lasting. So thank you all very much for your time, and I hope you're staying warm and safe in Boston.